Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Get easy, seasonal recipes and pre-measured ingredients delivered right to your door. All you've got to do is cook and enjoy. And my listeners can get 9 free meals. Can you believe it? 9 free meals when you go to HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats9 and use the promo code GoodSeats9. Yep, 9 free meals with HelloFresh for a limited time. Go to HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats9 and use the promo code GoodSeats9. Here's our show.
I always wanted to be a gangster, a drug dealer, a pimp, a player, a hustler.
Marvin picks it up and stuffs it.
To Marvin, pretty play. 2 for Marvin Barnes.
One-hand jump, up and in.
Marvin Barnes and the Spirits of St. Louis existed for only 2 short years.
The Spirits are the NBA's 31st team.
They transformed both pro basketball and the business of pro sports.
Marvin, a jumper over Paul. Yes!
The Spirits may be more relevant today than when the ABA folded 40 years ago.
It was almost like an all-star team.
We had a lot of guys that could play.
We had a chance to win it all with the talent we had on the team.
With 5, the jumper! Yes! Yes! He made it!
They had as much talent as anybody, but they would just self-destruct.
We didn't care about the game. We wondered where the next party was at, where that candy at, where them girls at.
I would send hookers to the hotel rooms with some of the greatest players in the game and say, drain them. Have sex with them till he can't move.
Marvin Barnes was a bad guy. He was accused of hitting one of his teammates with a tire iron.
He was thrown out for sucker punching opponents. His own teammate coined the nickname Bad News.
Marvin Barnes only cared about one person, Marvin Barnes.
One day out of the blue, he just disappeared.
He was gone, and for 10 days he was missing.
I remember saying to the owners, damn, I didn't know I was this good. I need more money.
For all the trouble that Marvin caused, I still wanted Marvin with me.
The short jump, Marvin, yes. Barnes is on fire.
Compared to the NBA, the ABA was fabulous.
The league was in the entertainment business.
If a fight would break out and you stayed on the bench, you were in big trouble.
The ABA began to fall apart, and either a merger was going to happen or we were going out of business.
The Spirits owners, they really wanted to be part of the NBA, and when that couldn't happen, they devised their own plan.
Hundreds of millions of dollars have flowed into the coffers of the Spirits of St. Louis.
It's like hitting megabucks.
They have the greatest settlement in all of professional sports history.
If you wanted to take a single franchise that captured everything, just about everything, that was crazy about the ABA, look no further than the Spirits of St. Louis.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Greetings and salutations. Hello, friends. My name is Tim Hanlon, and of course, you have found Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast excursion each and every week into the wacky and sometimes tragic world of what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for coming in. Welcome to the proceedings. And the ABA is what we're kind of tackling today, and a bit of an extension of that story. You heard the clip there, of course, the promo for the great movie called Free Spirits by our pal Dan Forer, the ESPN 30 documentary about the 2-year wonder of the Spirits of St. Louis in the last 2 years of the American Basketball Association. In many respects, almost emblematic, not only as a team by itself, but also of the broader ABA generally, in terms of the wackiness, the craziness, the ups and downs, if you will, of that league. And we highly recommend, of course, as part of your education as we get into this episode in a few moments, to not only find that documentary and enjoy it immensely, but also listen to our episode 8, our interview with Dan Forer, as we discuss not only the team, but also perhaps the most notable name associated with that franchise and beyond, which is the topic of our conversation this week. His name was Marvin Barnes, a.k.a. Bad News Barnes, and it is a story of talent wasted over time and ultimately tragedy, as we're going to get into with our guest this week, Mike Carey, the borderline legendary sports writer in Boston for many, many years, And we're going to get into the life and times of this most enigmatic character named Marvin Barnes, a tremendous talent in the early 70s. He could light up the boards. At Providence College, he led them into the Final Four and tremendous seasons of basketball glory at the collegiate level, and was one of the most sought-after draft picks, both from the NBA and the ABA, but he went to the St. Louis Spirits. Let's put it this way. His talent on the basketball court was unquestioned when he was paying attention and when he was focused. You heard Bob Costas, who, as you may know, was the voice of the Spirits, coming right out of Syracuse as a Cub announcer, fresh out of college and his first sort of professional play-by-play gig. And his preface of this book by Mike Carey, which is called Bad News: The Turbulent Life of Marvin Barnes, which we're going to get into in a few moments. The preface alone by Bob is it really puts it all into perspective. He basically said that, and we're going to get into it. Marvin Barnes was not only one of the great untold stories of American sports, but in terms of his playing capabilities, Costas has been said to say that Barnes was one of the best basketball players he ever saw. For example, Julius Erving, right, the personification of the ABA. There were nights, Costas recollects, that Barnes completely outplayed Julius Erving, right, the best and legendary players of the ABA. Not sort of kept up with him, but literally wiped the court with him, one-on-one as the better of the two players. Moses Malone, right, broke into the ABA the same year as Marvin Barnes did, and we all know what happened to Malone. He had a long-term Hall of Fame career across both the ABA and the NBA. Malone was the NBA MVP for 3 years in his career. People forget that Marvin Barnes, in the 1974-75 season, his rookie season, he was the ABA's Rookie of the Year. He was a tremendous talent. He could light it up. I mean, there were games where he had 40, 50 points a game. But as we're going to get into with Mike Carey in just a few moments, the story of Marvin Barnes is absolutely one of tremendous talent wasted away by ultimately a personality driven astray by drug addiction that frankly haunted Barnes for the majority of his adult life. And we'll see and we'll hear in frankly some very personal terms. Mike Carey got to know Marvin Barnes a lot during his post-professional career, or at least the tail end of it. This was a lifestyle and frankly, just a corralling of life by drug addiction that in many cases, Marvin Barnes attempted many opportunities to get out of the grips of it, and it just continued to sort of fall flat and out of sobriety despite some of the best efforts. And look, you listen to some of the clips or find some of those clips of Marvin Barnes not only playing, but being interviewed, and a very jovial guy, a very, well-meaning soul, if you will. Certainly in the years, in his later years, was trying to basically create himself as an example of what not to do, and trying to warn kids and young adults to find a straighter path and recognize the pitfalls of what their lives might have sort of fallen into. But despite of all the opportunities and the efforts and to climb that mountain, and there were certain times, as Mike will tell us in our conversation, that Marvin seemed to be kind of approaching that summit and conquering his devils and his fears and his trials and tribulations with drugs. But it just always seemed to sort of fall back, and ultimately it consumed him near the end. So this is a story not only of tragedy and sadness, but maybe of inspiration about a life not wasted, but actually well lived, in that it serves as a reminder and as a representative life to learn from. Certainly, the man was very talented, and the tragedies that befell him are not in vain. And we're going to get into a very compelling conversation, at sometimes very personal conversation, with our guest this week, Mike Carey, the author of Bad News: The Turbulent Life of Marvin Barnes. The book is fantastic. The conversation is also very interesting, and I encourage you to listen to all of it and enjoy it. and we present it to you in all its context, and we can't wait to deliver it to you in just a moment or two. But before we get there, we want to tell you about our pals Mack Weldon, the premium men's essentials brand that believes in smart design and premium fabrics. It's designed to be, frankly, the most comfortable underwear and socks and shirts and undershirts and hoodies and sweatpants, you get the idea, that you'll ever wear. Mack Weldon, also the pioneers of antimicrobial technology that ensures that all those basics in your clothing line, guys, will eliminate odor. Now, it doesn't mean you can get out of washing the items, friends. No. You got to do that on a regular basis, of course. But when you're wearing them and you're sweating and doing whatever you're doing, you're guaranteed essentially to not stink up the joint as you comfort and luxuriate in these great clothes by our pals at Mack Weldon. And if you go to MackWeldon.com and use the promo code GOODSEATS, for your first order, you're going to get 20% off all these fine items. And some of those items obviously include things like underwear. If you're a boxers guy, they got you covered. If you're a briefs guy, they got you covered. If you're into both of them, because the situation may be different depending on the day and the time, if you know what I mean. No problems there. And obviously Mack Weldon, well known and well regarded for their extensive line of undergarments and underwear, but also, as I said earlier, lots of other basics that you'll need. And I'll tell you from personal experience, their sock collection, which I have a ton of, I've gotten over the last couple of weeks by going to MackWeldon.com and using that promo code GOODSEATS. I got 20% off all of my, frankly, all my socks that are going to set me up for the fall and the winter and even the spring. They're well crafted. They sit on the top of your calf. They come in a tremendous array of colors and designs. Lord knows my wife will tell you that I could have used a refresh, shall we say, for my sock collection. And Mack Weldon has come to the rescue, as well as a bunch of undershirts. I got a sweatshirt out of the deal, and also a few new boxers. Yes, that's the way I kind of go, if you know what I mean. And you too can enjoy all the great stuff that Mack Weldon has to offer. Like I said, they're comfortable, they're well-designed, and that antimicrobial technology keeps you sweat and odor-free. And it's a tremendous set of stuff that Mack Weldon has. And again, we've got a promo code for you, and it's 20% off of your first order at MackWeldon.com. It's MackWeldon. MackWeldon.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS, all one word, GOODSEATS, at MackWeldon.com, and you're going to get 20% off your first order from our new pals and our great sponsors and our friends at Mack Weldon. Thank you, Mack Weldon. We appreciate it. All right, let us move on nice and smooth. See into our conversation, our very interesting one, and it gets very personal, but very intriguing with our new pal Mike Carey as we talk about the life and times of marvelous, or depending on your perspective, bad news, Marvin Barnes, the St. Louis Spirits ABA standout. And here's our conversation we had just a couple of weeks back. Please enjoy. You can't talk about the Spirits of St. Louis and then by extension the ABA without talking about Marvin Barnes. And lo and behold, you've written sort of the definitive biography and amazing and not so great at the end story of this perhaps most enigmatic player and star that ever played in the ABA, and hence the reach out. And I'm just amazingly about the story. I'm amazed at it, and I'm also very curious as to how you even got involved with the late great Marvin Barnes. So maybe we can start there. What's your background, and how do you bump into and or get enmeshed with the story of Marvin Barnes?
I was a news editor at the Boston Herald American, and I love sports. I didn't cover sports at the time, but a teammate of Marvin's, a guy named Kevin Stakem, I got to know him a little bit. He was a friend of mine, and he said, "Why don't you do a story on Marvin Barnes?" And I was a bit reluctant because I knew his reputation was, very sketchy. I knew he had gotten in a couple jams, robbed the city bus when he was in high school, he also pled guilty to hitting a teammate at Providence with a tire iron. So I really didn't want to do it, but Stakem said, no, he's really gotten a bad reputation from this thing. He doesn't deserve it. Would you look into it? So I said, sure.
When was this? This was after his ABA days and during his NBA days? Roughly when was this sort of suggestion that you reach out and sort of do a story on him?
It was the fall of '75. And he had just gotten, Marvin had played 2 years in the ABA and then it folded. And he had just been taken by the Detroit Pistons in the ABA dispersal draft. I didn't know him, but I was just leery of doing anything with him because he just had a reputation of being a thug. But I respected Kevin Stakem because he said, no, he's not a thug. You'll like the guy. So I called up and I was going to meet him at a Celtic Pistons game in Hartford, Connecticut. It was all arranged. So I drive down to Hartford and Marvin won't talk to me. I said, why won't he talk to me? And Marvin had like a hotel suite for the game. And I was supposed to meet him in his room after the game. And when I get up there, there's these two huge guys standing at the door and they won't let me in. So I said, just tell them that Mike Carey's here. And the guy comes back and he says, Marvin doesn't want to talk to you. So I go home. I give up on the story. I said, this is ridiculous. I go home, I think about it, and I go, I'm going to do this story whether he likes it or not. I end up buying the court transcripts of his case, both his criminal case and his civil case, against the criminal case was for assault for hitting this Providence teammate named Larry Convertis with a tire iron. I read it over and it was 2 or 3 days into the trial and Marvin decided he was going to plead guilty. So he pleads guilty, and about 6 months later, he's about to join the Pistons. He gets sued by Convertis in civil court, and so I get both transcripts, and they're thick transcripts, and I start reading the civil trial because the criminal trial didn't really only went for a day, and then Marvin pled guilty. So there was nothing in there to interest me, and it certainly, I think they only got through one witness or two witnesses. But so I get the civil trial, and it's huge, and I read the whole transcript, and by the end of the transcript, I'm convinced that Marvin didn't hit the guy with the tire iron. And I read the transcript of the civil trial, which goes into a great amount of detail. And I interview not only Marvin and the guy that he got in a fight with, but I also interviewed the team doctors, the coaches, the lawyers, the judge, everybody. And I end up writing the story, and it actually won a couple of awards for investigative reporting. So that's how I got to meet Marvin.
So this is after his departure, and we'll get into that probably in a few minutes, right? The spirits of St. Louis and going to Detroit, but he couldn't play for the Pistons because of this case from a few years back that was now coming to trial. Is that how it sort of?
No. I didn't meet Marvin until he was with Detroit, but he had already played 2 years with the Spirits of St. Louis. I didn't know him. I didn't know him when he was with the Spirits. I didn't know him when he was with Providence College. But, you know, for some reason, Stakem thought that he was getting a lot of bad publicity for this attack with a tire iron that was undeserved. I mean, in reading the transcripts, there was just so much evidence that, you know, that Marvin didn't do it, that I came to, you know, and believe me, I after Marvin stiffed me for that interview, I thought, you know, I said, this guy's a jerk. He's just gonna, you know, there was no reason. I was just so mad at him. I said, you know, I'm going to do the story anyhow. And he you know, I don't care what Stakem wants or anything. I was out to, you know, if he hit the kid with a tire iron, it wasn't going to be a great story from Marvin's perspective. But the more I read the background on this, and it all happened, you know, it happened when in Marvin's junior year, I want to say, it was at a practice. Marvin got hit by Cadvertis with an elbow. You know, he ended up going to the dentist. He was going to lose 2 teeth. The dentist glued the teeth back in, but he was going to lose the teeth. It wasn't even a practice. It was like a inter squad scrimmage that this happened at.
But he copped to it though, even though, and then after the fact with your reporting to even underline it, he pleaded guilty and essentially paid some money and was placed on probation, right? That's how he then went on to the rest of his collegiate career and the beginnings of his pro career, right? And that is where you sort of came into the story, was sort of after that fact, right?
Right. I mean, when he pled guilty, he was placed on probation. You know, and that should have been the end of it. But in Marvin's first year as a pro, no, I take that back. In Marvin's, I think the probation was for 3 years. And in Marvin's first year with Detroit, he gets caught carrying an empty gun onto an airplane. And it's just that back then, there just weren't any hijacking, you know, worries. I mean, it was just, when he got caught with the gun, it was just a misdemeanor. But even though it was just a misdemeanor, it violated his parole. So he had to spend 6 months in prison. And that's when Stakem came to me and said, "Will you do a story on this guy? People don't realize what a nice guy is," and blah, blah, blah. And I said, "Okay, I'll do it." And of course, after his first year with Detroit, he served his prison time in a prison in Cranston, Rhode Island. And when my story came out, he called me up, and you know, I didn't expect to hear from him because he didn't want to talk to me for the story. But he calls me up and he said, "I loved the story. It was great." My curiosity got the best of me, really. I said, "Okay, I'll meet you down at," you know, and he was in prison at the time. He called me from prison. And so I said, "Okay, I'll come down and visit you." And he wanted to meet me, and I was sort of curious to meet him. And that's how our relationship began.
So that's interesting. In some respects, it almost sounds like this piece, I won't say exonerated him, but it was like a sort of a new sort of piece of evidence or storyline or narrative that, you know, arguably could have helped him a little earlier in this whole process, right? But in many respects, it almost seems like it kind of, at least for the time being, gave him some level of, I don't know, validation, justification. I didn't do this, or you know, I'm being overly admonished for frankly something that I really never did, even though I admitted it. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, he and his explanation for why he pleaded guilty made a lot of sense to me. I think it would, you know, he had a he had a contract at stake. He was still at Providence College, and he was going to make a couple $1 million. I mean, which was big money back then. The only thing that if he pled not guilty and was found to be guilty, he was facing a minimum of 3 years in prison. So, from his point of view, here's a kid from the ghetto who grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother, his sister, his father, who was an alcoholic and a wife abuser. So there were 4 people in this little dinky apartment. It wasn't a very nice neighborhood either. It was, and Providence back then was almost entirely white. It was really hard for a black kid growing up in Providence to get a fair shake. So, when Marvin was going to court to defend himself against a criminal charge, he listened to the lawyer. I don't know how much, what the outcome would have been. Nobody knows that, but he decided to take, he took the guilty plea. It was just supposed to be probation, but he ended up, like I say, getting charged with bringing an unloaded gun onto an airplane, and it was, even though it was just a misdemeanor, that was a violation of his probation terms, and so he ended up having to go to prison. So when I met him, I mean, it was at the prison.
So a whole bunch of questions, right? So
sure.
The first of which kind of strikes me as being very interesting and maybe almost surprising, in that you're meeting up with him after his 1+ year, almost 2 years of ABA spirits stardom, if you will, and interesting stories. But so he didn't violate the probation during that period of time in the ABA then, I'm guessing. So that's interesting how he wouldn't have, if you will, tripped the wire prior to that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a dumb thing for Marvin to do. I mean, some of Marvin's actions, you just shake your head at. You say, how could he do that? Why would he do that? And as I would later find out, I mean, he had a fascination with gangsters. He just, while he was in St. Louis, he met a guy named Roosevelt Patch Becton, Becton, and they became great friends. And Marvin would find out very shortly after meeting him that Becton was just the Midwest kingpin for marijuana. He sold marijuana all across the country, and he was based out of St. Louis, and that's how Marvin met him. And Becton loved Marvin, invited him to all these orgies and parties and events that he was throwing for his all these millionaires who were buying marijuana by the ton. So Marvin would be at these parties, and he'd be walking around these parties nude with a 45 Colt slung over his shoulder, and never got in any trouble with it, and wasn't really a part of Becton's drug distribution gang, but he was like the public relations man for Becton. I mean, Becton would fly in these buyers from around the country, and he'd take them to a spirits game, and Marvin would come over and say hello to these guys, and then Becton and Marvin and a couple other members of Becton's gang would take these guys out for dinner and wine and dine them, And, Marvin was great for this guy's business. And eventually he made Marvin a minor partner. Marvin was making probably almost as much money working for Beckton that he was as a member of the Spirits. And of course, nobody knew. I mean, people knew that he was friends with this guy, but nobody knew the extent of what Marvin was doing. I mean, he wasn't doing any, like I say, he wasn't selling any drugs, but he had a fascination with gangsters. Always did, from the time he was a little kid.
Who found who, though? Was it Beckton finding Barnes and finding a mark slash, a bright light and sexy at that because he's playing pro basketball, or kind of was it the other way around?
No, not really. I mean, Beckton obviously liked Marvin a lot, but Beckton had other athletes that he'd invite to they had these wild orgies. That's all I mean, they were orgies. I mean, you'd knock on the door, you'd take off your clothes, and you'd have an endless supply of booze, cocaine, and marijuana sitting on coffee tables, and and beautiful women. I never attended one, but I've heard a lot of stories about them. And Beckton was very well known especially to the black athletes in St. Louis, the baseball players, the football players, some of the basketball players. But when teams from out of state came in, they'd stay at a hotel that was and Beckton also owned a nightclub. And so when teams would come in for a game in St. Louis, no matter what the sport was, they'd go to Beckton's nightclub, which was only like a block away from the two biggest hotels in St. Louis. So Beckton was a real, and he was a nice guy. I mean, I have actually talked to him on the phone a number of times, and you'd never, from the way he talks and from what he has to say, you just never know he was one of the biggest, marijuana distributors in the country, if not the biggest. By the time Marvin got to Detroit, I mean, Beckton was sending him $10,000 every 2 weeks, and that was Marvin's cut of the profits, and Marvin didn't have to do anything for it. So Marvin's saying, "Oh, this is a great deal," and it finally caught up to him when he got to the Spirits, and I never asked Marvin this, but I'm sure he got that gun as a way of impressing Beckton, because according to Marvin, all these gangsters carried a weapon. It was pretty crazy, because here's this guy that's rookie of the year in his first year, and all-star his second year with the Spirits, and yet for Marvin, he's more concerned with what party am I going to next than when's our next game.
An undeniable talent, right? He obviously was making some decent coin relative to the time. I mean, he was a second-round pick in the NBA draft by the Sixers, and then
he wasn't a second-round pick. He was the second pick.
That's what I meant. He was a second pick overall. I'm sorry, in the first round. That's what I meant. Second pick overall. I mean, and to choose to go to St. Louis, that in of itself is eyebrow raising. But still, bidding war and all that kind of stuff. I mean, so it wasn't like. So was he just paranoid? It would seem to me alone, given obviously talent that perhaps he. And we'll get into this maybe in a few minutes, but maybe he didn't even know how good he was, or frankly, he did know how good he was, right? Didn't sort of hone it or sort of corral it, so to speak. But it would seem to me that alone sort of tending to one's budding pro career, given all the expectations and the money, right? Then adding to that a fascination / I don't know, second side job as a hustler slash, mob, attaché. I don't know. It just seems like a weird second double life there.
Well, for you and me, it would be. But for Marvin, it was just, like I say, he loved the gangster world. He really did. He, he grew up as a kid sitting in front of a TV and watching all these episodes of The Untouchables. And, he just, from the time he was a tiny kid, I mean, he just fell in love with being a gangster. By the time he gets to high school, his goal in life, he didn't think he was going to live past 21. I mean, he thought he was going to die in a shootout in some street. I mean, that's how much of a fascination with crime he had. I mean, he loved being around these guys, but he didn't have an active part in it, other than being the host of these orgies, which didn't happen. They were maybe once every 2 months. You'd get 10 buyers from around the country that would show up, and this guy Becton, he'd supply the women, he'd supply the booze. It was his way of thanking his best customers for being so loyal. And so Marvin was hired to basically not just because of his physical size, but because he was just a friendly guy, outgoing guy, told jokes, made sure everybody was happy. And that's all Becton wanted from him. Becton, didn't want him to have any active role in this drug operation. And so, for Marvin, it was like heaven. I mean, it ended up destroying him because he ended, from marijuana, it ended up being cocaine. And then later on in life, he started doing heroin, and, it just eventually it killed him. There came a point when he was, as his NBA career kept going, his stats went right down the tubes. I mean, by the time he got to the Celtics, which was only 4 years into his career, he was, he was an addict. It was sad to see. I mean, by then I knew him. I mean, by then I knew him, and I knew he had a problem. And, it broke up his marriage. It left him broke. It was a sad thing to watch.
But let's pick up the story as you sort of, I guess, started or established some kind of relationship with him, because it seems to me like you're meeting him at a, in retrospect, kind of a I don't call it a pivotal time, but certainly going from one sort of extreme and or sort of upward trend, I guess, as a basketball player and as a pro, the career, kind of sort of in that other direction, right? I guess you could. It seems like he was going back to the Pistons after he's done his jail time, right? But I can't imagine that the Pistons were necessarily welcoming with open arms, and it maybe even set up, I guess, a bit of a convoluted map, I guess, for how he might or might not continue his playing career that started off so brilliantly, frankly, albeit erratically and quite colorfully in St. Louis. I got to think it left a mark on him when not only going back to Detroit, but any of the other teams that he wound up playing in the NBA and then, in minor leagues afterwards.
Yeah, he played decently in Detroit. He had a coach that he really liked, Herbie Brown, who was Larry Brown's brother. So Marvin, despite the distractions, he played fairly well for Herbie Brown. But then they fired Herbie Brown, and Marvin rebelled. Marvin he hated the organization. He hated the owner. He hated the general manager. And he was fiercely loyal to Herbie Brown. So they finally got rid of him. They couldn't handle him. They just couldn't handle Marvin anymore. I don't want to say he was a full-fledged addict, but he was close. And they didn't have a clue. I mean, the problem is and especially in the ABA and in the time period that Marvin played, using cocaine it just wasn't considered a major deal. I mean, I've asked a number of players from the ABA and even the early 80s when Marvin was in the NBA. I've asked them about, how prevalent was drug use among the players when you played. And most of them say their guess is that well over 60% of the players used cocaine. It was viewed as a recreational drug and a somewhat harmless drug. There were a number of guys, all-star players, that had a drug habit. They didn't test for drugs back then. So you had guys like George Gervin, David Thompson, Marvin. These are just guys that, off the top of my head, but there were quite a few big-time stars that were using drugs. And like I say, they didn't have a drug testing program, and these guys were so talented. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't just 3 or 4 guys. There were a lot of guys that used it, but you'd be surprised at the names of some of these guys. They'd go out and get high after a game or before a game. It was that prevalent.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, this is also, you're talking about young guys, big contracts, and, not unlike, say, the music industry or the entertainment industry, right? Where, I mean, in the mid to late 70s, I mean, coke was the quote unquote designer drug of choice. And I want to say it was just chalk it up to a different time, but, there's no doubt that it was not only prevalent, but it was, clearly addictive. And it's like anything, right? I don't know how much you can use it in moderation because it's such an addictive drug, but it's clear it got the best of Marvin. But it seems to me that the seeds of, well, some of this obviously has to be psychological profile too. You were talking before about sort of him, rebelling and leaving, or effectively leaving, getting all upset when, the coach that had sort of brought him along with the Pistons was sort of, was out of the picture. To me, that almost feels like, I mean, you look at the St. Louis days, it was pretty clear. And maybe because he was such a high draft pick, because they spent so much money on him, and he was the, admittedly, kind of the star player of the team, he was coddled, right? I mean, it seems like they kind of looked the other way with all this sort of, in retrospect, bizarre behavior, right? I guess they would call that today, they would call that enabling.
Yeah, I don't think they knew anything about his drug problems, but they knew he was unpredictable. He'd have great games, and then he'd have terrible games. For him, terrible. For everybody else, probably average. But Marvin was just such a talent that they should have fined him for missing practices, missing planes, lack of effort. There were a number of things they could have fined him for, but they didn't, because the owner loved Marvin. The general manager, was powerless because even if they fined Marvin, and they would always announce, Marvin's going to be fined for this, and he never was, because the owner didn't want to fine him. I mean, it got so bad that Harry Weltman, the GM, was just, couldn't figure out what to do because the owner wouldn't let him fine him. He could announce there was a fine, but Marvin knew he wasn't going to have to pay anything. Some of the other players on the team, they weren't mad at Marvin because they knew, this was Marvin, but they were mad at the Spirits for not trying to influence Marvin in the right way. But it was a crazy team. I mean, the Spirits of St. Louis were, they had, when in Marvin's rookie year, they also had Gus Gerard, who was a rookie, and they had Fly Williams, who was a rookie. And all three of them were addicted to cocaine by the end of their rookie season. So you had 3 rookies that were, all using drugs. And, I don't know whether management knew it or not, but they, Gus Gerard was a quiet kid, went to Virginia, good player, didn't cause any problems. But you had Fly Williams, who was, a crazy guy. Today, Fly Williams is sitting in a New York prison because he'll be on trial shortly for selling cocaine and heroin to high school age kids. He was running this heroin ring that was a multi-million-dollar ring, and the New York City task force eventually caught him. So you had, between him and Marvin, Gus really wasn't a problem. He hid his habit pretty cleverly, and eventually it caught up to Gus, and his marriage broke up, and his career ended prematurely, and he was the only one of the 3 of those guys who ended up salvaging his life. I mean, he went to rehab, got clean, and stayed clean. Ended up being a drug counselor in Texas, and today is a very productive guy and a very inspirational speaker. And he talks quite openly about the problems he had. And so did Marvin. I mean, Marvin would tell. In his later years, Marvin would give talks to high school kids, and these talks he was a great speaker. He did some good work with kids, but eventually the drugs, he just couldn't say no to drugs.
All right, what's this? HelloFresh. HelloFresh, yes, America's #1 meal kit, of course. Get easy seasonal recipes and pre-measured ingredients delivered right to your door. With HelloFresh, all you have to do is cook and enjoy. Exactly what I've been doing the last couple of days, as we've been enjoying in the Hanlon household some delicious HelloFresh meals. Not only delicious, but simple and straightforward and easy to make. HelloFresh makes cooking delicious meals at home, of course, a reality, regardless of your comfort in the kitchen. From step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients, you'll have everything you need to get a wow-worthy dinner on the table in just about 30 minutes. Say goodbye to endless grocery store trips and takeout food. HelloFresh has you covered. Break out of your dinner rut with HelloFresh's over 20 seasonal chef-curated recipes each week. There's something for everyone, from family recipes to calorie-smart and vegetarian, and fun menu series like Hall of Fame and craft burgers. HelloFresh has more 5-star recipes than any other meal kit, so you'll always get something delicious. And it's also flexible and fits your lifestyle. Add extra meals to your weekly order, perhaps even adding on yummy additions like garlic bread or even cookie dough. You can easily change your delivery days or your food preferences. Heck, you can even skip a week whenever you need. HelloFresh has got you covered. We love it. Give it a try. I guarantee you're gonna enjoy it. And here's a great incentive to do so. How about 9 free meals? Yes, I said 9 free meals when you use the promo code GoodSeats9 at HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats9. That's HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats9, the number 9. And make sure you use the promo code GoodSeats9, and you're going to get 9 free meals, courtesy of us and HelloFresh. It's a great deal, and may I suggest when you're choosing those first 9 meals, that 2 of them be the sesame beef tacos with quick pickled veggies and chili sour cream, which we just had last night in the Hanlon household. We loved it tremendously. And then 2 nights before that, we also had a tremendous meal. The chicken sausage and spinach ricotta ravioli with tomato and lemon. That was thumbs up, too, from the Hanlon clan. So that's just 2 of the 9 we could have chosen, but go for it. 9 free meals when you go to HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats9. Again, HelloFresh.com/GoodSeats and the number 9. And use that promo code, too, when you're on the site, GoodSeats9, and get 9 free meals. Again, from our friends at HelloFresh. We love the food and we love our friends at HelloFresh, and you will too. And while you search up that deal and get your web browser and your order in there, how about a return to our conversation? Do you think, and I know you came into this story of his pro career somewhat in medias res, right? I mean, you were not there for the St. Louis years. You didn't see him, or maybe we're not sort of innately aware of his Providence days prior to sort of coming into the story years later. Which do you think kind of created the other? Do you think the erratic behavior and the upbringing and the whatever the psychological profile of growing up in a terrible neighborhood and a rough childhood and all that kind of stuff begetting the drugs, or do you think the drugs ultimately kind of enabled the bad behavior and the craziness and ultimately, and I want to ask your thoughts about this, his bolting from the Spirits with basically leaving the team, right, which is sort of the ultimate act of craziness? Well,
that was leaving the team was a 3-day event. I mean, he was told by a teammate that his contract was terrible and he had made a big mistake signing it. And Marvin bought into that and fired his agent.
This is Joe Caldwell, the guy that you're talking about that was kind of
Joe Caldwell, yeah. And Marvin went to Caldwell. It wasn't Caldwell going to Marvin, but when Marvin went to Caldwell was the team rep. And Caldwell, listened to Marvin, and when he heard the whole thing, he said, "Man, you have a bad deal. You don't have any. You don't even have any guarantees on your contract. If you get injured, they don't have to pay you." And that, Marvin heard that, and he just took off. I mean, Caldwell hooked him up with his agent. Marvin fired the guy that was hiring him, a guy named Bob Wolf, who one of the biggest agents in the business, but I didn't particularly care for the guy, but he was a big name. I mean, he represented Bird when Bird came into the NBA, and so Wolf was a pretty big guy. But Marvin had been taking money from Wolf for three of his last 4 years in college. Wolf had been sending him money, which were loans, but still illegal for an agent to do. And that's why Marvin went with Wolf, and it was Wolf that pushed Marvin to sign with St. Louis rather than signing with Philadelphia. Wolf was double dipping. I mean, he got his 10% commission from Marvin, and he also got 10% commission from the Spirits. So Wolf was raking in a ton of dough, and and of course, double dipping is it's just unethical. And of course, Wolf didn't tell Marvin that he was taking money from the Spirits, because Marvin would have put two and two together and say, well, why are you pushing me to the Spirits when I'm the second pick in the NBA draft? But it just didn't occur to Marvin that, and I don't think he realized the implications of playing in the ABA. I mean, it was a great league. But I think with the way Marvin thought, with his mindset, I'm convinced he would have been far better off if he signed with the NBA, because the NBA had structure. I don't think Marvin would have been able to get away with the things that, he got away with in the ABA. It's tough. I know he wouldn't have met a guy like Roosevelt Becton. I think he would have gotten more discipline. He just would have had a more structured life, because from day one in St. Louis, I mean, Marvin could do whatever Marvin wanted. I mean, he was a funny guy. He was a glib guy. He had a bundle of talent. And, outside of that, the 3 days that he took off and went to a pool tournament in Akron, Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio, he didn't cause many problems, and his teammates all loved him. His coach that first year loved him. The thing in doing this book, I didn't find too many teammates or coaches that disliked Marvin. He was a funny guy. He was a nice guy. He was just a likable guy. And, it's a shame what happened to him. It's just, and like I say, by the time he was traded from the Pistons, and he was traded to Buffalo. He spent a year in Buffalo.
Buffalo Braves, the 77-78 season, yeah.
Yeah. And by that time, he had lost all his talent. He'd have a good game. One in 6 or 7 games would be good, and the rest of them he'd stink. From Buffalo, he went to the Celtics. Started it out. Now he's in his. He's in the. He's 20 miles from home, 30 miles from home, and if anything was going to straighten him out, it would have been playing for the Boston Celtics, but it didn't. And he told the story on himself. Eventually, he's sitting on the Celtics bench with a towel over his head, snorting cocaine. And
on the bench during a game?
During the game. And blood is trickling down his nose. And sitting next to him was Don Chaney, another player and a good player and a good guy. And Chaney looks over and he sees what's going on, and he just sprints to the other end of the bench to get away from Marvin. And and that was I think it was in February, and Marvin, I think that it wasn't the event. Nobody knew about it except for Chaney, and Chaney didn't say anything to anybody. But that just showed, it showed how badly Marvin was ruined. And, it wasn't more than 3 or 4 weeks later that Marvin had called in sick for a couple games, and he wasn't sick. He was hungover. He was drugged out, but and Cowens, who was the coach, Dave Cowens was a player coach at the time, just finally said, cut him. Dave, even for all the trouble that Marvin caused Dave Cowens, who, the first time Cowens had ever coached, he's a young guy. I think he's 29, 30 years old. They make a coaching change. They fire Satch Sanders, who had been the coach for a couple of years, and they decide they're going to hire Dave, at 29 years old or 30 years old to be the coach.
Yeah, only a few years older than he was, Marvin.
Yeah, they were about the same age. But, even Dave, Dave, despite all the trouble that Marvin presented, missing practices, missing planes, acting goofy, probably from the drugs, Dave finally, he had no choice. He said, I'm letting you go, and Marvin didn't put up a fight because he knew he had screwed up. Marvin ended up, back in Providence, and everybody pretty well thought his career was over, but he ended up, playing another year with, he got cut from the Clippers, but the Clippers coach was Gene Shue, not coincidentally, but who had been the general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers when they drafted Marvin. And Shue loved Marvin's talent. So even though, there were all these stories floating around the league about, crazy things that Marvin had done, Shue offered him a tryout. He goes to the tryout, and 2 days into at a rookie camp, and 2 days into it, the Shue cuts Marvin, and of course Marvin hadn't played for like 5 months. He was cut in February, and here we are in August. Marvin gets this call out of the blue from Gene Shue, who says, "Why don't you, why don't you try out for our team? Come to rookie camp and work with the rookies, and hopefully we'll end up keeping you." Well, Marvin was so out of shape. He showed up, and even Gene Shue, who had just a ton of faith in Marv, had no choice but to cut him. I mean, then so Marvin goes home, starts feeling sorry for himself, using drugs, and lo and behold, Gene Shue calls him again, and now I think it's January of the next year, and Shue is desperate for help. He's got some injuries. Bill Walton's on his team, and Walton has some foot injuries. Marvin sort of needs Shue sort of needs a big guy like Marvin to both back up Walton and maybe even play a little power forward. So Marvin says, "Okay, sounds good," and he goes out there, and by then we're talking about 5 years into his career, 4 years into his career, and all his talent has evaporated. He's just not the player that he was. He's staying sober. He's buddy with Walton. They've been good friends since college days, but he just couldn't do it. Couldn't perform. He'd play 5 minutes, 10 minutes a game. Gave a full effort, but he had no legs. His legs were shot. He wasn't in shape. I mean, he just a shadow of his former self. And at the end of the year, the Clippers still had a chance to make the playoffs, and they had to win the final 3 games, and I think they won the first. But the second game, they're down by a point. Marvin's on the court, and World Free, their guard, has the ball in the final 10 seconds, and everybody thought for sure that World Free, with his great outside shooting, was going to take the final shot, and he passed it into Marvin, who's all alone 7 feet from the basket, and he puts up a shot that's a 5-foot air ball. And the Clippers lose, they're eliminated, and that was Marvin's final NBA shot. He went on, he played in the CBA, played for the Detroit Spirits, not to be confused with the Spirits of St. Louis. This is a Continental Basketball Association, and he's back using drugs heavily, and eventually he's calling in sick for games, and wasn't producing. I mean, when the Detroit franchise signed Marvin, they fly him out and they have a big press conference, and Marvin, is telling everybody that, come see Bad News play. I'm to take this league by storm, and he just did. He was, he'd miss practices. He'd be late for games, or just wouldn't show up for a game, and eventually the GM had no choice but to let him go. He played another year in the CBA. He was terrible. He went overseas to Trieste, Italy, and got fired from that team. And all along the way, everybody suspects or knows that he's using drugs. And so his career basically was the 2 years in St. Louis. I mean, the rest of it, he was nothing. I mean, he was an average player or a below average player. And we're talking about a guy that anybody who saw Marvin play in college or saw him play in the ABA would say this guy's a Hall of Fame guy, can't miss. But by the time he got to the NBA and the Detroit Pistons, he was, like I say, he was an average player. He just, as Rod Thorne, who coached him in St. Louis for a season, and later became the vice president of the NBA for discipline. As Rod Thorne once said, I've never seen a guy so talented lose so much so fast, and that sums up his career.
Did you how close did you stay with him once you had finished that piece and he reached out to you to say thank you for the story and he thought it was good? Did you guys stay in touch on a somewhat regular basis after that?
Well, not while he was playing pro ball. I mean, I hear from him every now and then, but I didn't start hearing from him until, he had other, once he was out of basketball, and I want to say it was probably around 84 or 85, then I'd hear from him when he needed money. So would everybody, all his friends would hear from him I swear, I tell people this, I swear Marvin had this little list, and he'd write down the day he talked to you, the date that he talked to you. So, because he was calling everybody, he's calling all his friends, and, hey, can you loan me $50? And you knew you weren't getting the money. I mean, if you gave him the $50, you were not getting it back. I mean, he'd call all his former teammates. I have a story in the book. Marvin would, when Marvin would have an NBA schedule, and he was living in Detroit, and living in the ghetto, really. So, some nights he'd sleep in a junkyard. Some nights he'd sleep on somebody's porch, and they didn't even know he was there. He just was. He was, and he couldn't have weighed more than 190 pounds. I mean, he wasn't eating right. He looked terrible. And like I say, I mean, I wasn't the only one that was sending Marvin money. I mean, I know Kevin Stakem sent him money on a regular basis. I know Ernie DiGregorio sent him money on a regular basis. I know some of his NBA teammates sent him money if they had it. But it got so bad that I finally stopped, because I said, look, Marvin, if you need money for food or for clothing, go into a store, buy what you need, and have the store manager call me. And I said, but I'm not going to send you money. I'll pay for your. I want to talk to the store manager, but I'll pay for your groceries. I'll pay for your, any clothes you need, but I'm not going to do this anymore because I know that money's going for drugs. And it was just such a sad case. But for what your question about, how often did the only time I would really hear from Marvin for quite a while was when he needed money. And that, I think that was the case with everybody, all his friends. And Marvin had a ton of friends. I mean, he just would. Number one, I think he was embarrassed because he looked terrible. But number two, I mean, the drugs had taken over his life. I mean, he was really so hooked. Ended up, I want to say it was 1988 or 87. He ends up in Texas, in Houston, Texas, and he gets caught selling cocaine to some guy he knew. And so he's sentenced to 5 years in Texas prison, which is, probably the worst prison system in the world. And he ends up serving 2 years and 9 months in this prison. And but the only good thing is that, the prison was tough. You couldn't get any drugs. So for at least 2 years and 9 months, he was sober. And he put on a lot of weight in the right places. And he for the first time in years, he actually looked like a basketball player.
It almost seems like, well, I don't know. It seems like there were some occasions along his, decline in the NBA and even the CBA. You were mentioning that that general manager earlier, the Spirits, right? I think he kind of encapsulated. There was a story an article in the UPI where the general manager's name was Sam Washington. I think he basically said that, we're going to cut him because he won't be obligated to be at practice and the games, and we won't be obligated to look for him. We can't, he's not dependable. We can't trust him.
Well, yeah, I mean, Sam's dead now, but he was a good guy. I mean, he was the guy that went and recruited Marvin for the CBA. And he was a good guy, and he put up with all sorts of things with Marvin. And he finally, after Marvin had missed about 3 or 4 games in a row and was late for practices, Sam lost it. He went in and he said, look, I got 7 kids here who are all working their butt off to reach the NBA, and then I got you. And, I brought you in here to be an example for these young kids, and I'm tired of sending posses out to look for you when you disappear. He said, the free ride is over. See you later. And I had known Sam before then, and it's just coincidence that Marvin ended up signing with the, Detroit Spirits. I didn't think Sam. It didn't happen because I knew Sam. It just happened because Sam thought it was a good idea. Marvin had played in Detroit with the Pistons, and it seemed like a great public relations move. And if Marvin could play a lick, he'd help the team. But as usual, Marvin just, the drugs just took a hold of Marvin, and Marvin, Marvin ended up being a liability instead of being an asset. So I understood why Sam was doing what he was doing.
No, I guess my point is that it seems like that was sort of almost one of the sort of real last, chances. It seems like he didn't have any shortage, Marvin, of chances. You're talking about a personality. You're talking about a talent, or at least was certainly abundant and evident in the early part of his career. It seemed like there were, I don't want to say no shortage, but there were certainly enough people who were willing to give him a chance and even indulge him a little bit, given all the idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. But then obviously the drug part of it, right, seems to me just to be so overwhelming And arguably, I guess in today's pro game and stuff, there are programs and situations and various catch-alls and backstops, I guess, for that frankly probably didn't exist in certainly the ABA, and maybe a little bit of it in the NBA, and certainly probably not in the CBA, right? So it's almost like that support system that is probably around today. I mean, that maybe he could have benefited from just wasn't existent and or dependent on the goodness of those who had brought him in, and maybe just their inabilities, frankly, to kind of deal with it once they had brought him in.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a problem. There's so many guys from the NBA that went to rehab. There aren't many success stories. I mean, once you get hooked on that poison, there just aren't many success stories. I mean, Roy Tarpley was an alcoholic, and he got into drugs, and he ends up dying. And John Drew was an all-star. He gets, he goes to rehab and never resurfaces. David Thompson could have had a long career. I mean, David Thompson was still productive when he played for Denver, and he was an all-star every year. And then all of a sudden his numbers go down. You hear some horror stories about him, and he doesn't last more than a couple of years after that. Michael Ray Richardson. There were just so many of these guys that they all ended up in John Lucas's rehab. Lucas was a point guard for Houston, and Marvin knew him from college days, but Lucas the cops end up finding him in an alley in Milwaukee. The Rockets had played a game in Milwaukee. The cops in Milwaukee end up finding him in an alley with no shoes on, but wearing a suit, no shoes, and 3 pairs of sweat socks on each foot. And Bill Fitch was his coach, and Bill tried to help him but couldn't, and ended up cutting him, which Lucas says saved my life. I didn't realize at the time it saved my life. And Lucas has a fantastic treatment center. Marvin ended up going there. He was successful in the program. Spent, I believe it was 6 months in the rehab program. Lucas, when he's through his rehab, Lucas hires him as a counselor. Marvin's first out-of-town assignment was to Roy Tarpley was banned probably for 3 or 4 years, but they always say it was an indefinite suspension.
Yeah, I thought it was for life, actually, but maybe
yeah, but they say that, but it's like if you show that that you're clean and sober, they'll let you back in. But with Tarpley, he goes to Lucas's rehab. Marvin gets a call from Lucas, goes to the office. Lucas said, "I got an assignment for you." Roy is down in Wichita Falls, Texas, trying to play in the CBA. I talked to him. He sounds real sketchy. I want you to fly down to Wichita Falls, babysit Roy, make sure he stays off the drugs and the booze. So Marvin's all excited. It's his first out-of-town assignment. He goes home. He packs his stuff, gets to the airport, and he misses his flight, and it was the only flight to Wichita Falls that day, by 5 minutes. So what does Marvin do? On his way back to his apartment, he stops at a strip joint. And he's so frazzled, his nerves are so shot, and he knows he's going to disappoint Lucas because he missed that the plane. He doesn't call Lucas and say, "Can you rebook my flight? I missed it by 5 minutes. I missed the plane." He goes in and has 5 shots of whiskey, and that's all it took to send him off. Next thing you know, Marvin's on the prowl again. He's using cocaine. He's a mess. And that was he'd do this all through his adulthood. He ended up going out to California, and this was still in the 80s. Walton, it had to be 85. Walton calls him up and says, "Marvin, I want you to fly out and stay with me and my wife and the kids, and help me train for I have a chance to go to the Celtics. The Clippers have given me permission to that if I can work out a trade, I can go to the Celtics instead of being stuck with this crummy Clipper team." So Marvin goes out there, and Walton and Marvin work out for 3 or 4 months, and Walton ends up getting the trade. Celtics trade Maxwell and I think it was a first-round pick for Walton, and so Walton's heading to Boston, and Marvin doesn't know what he's going to do. So Walton says, "Well, do you want to come with me to Boston? Maybe I can talk Red Auerbach into giving you a tryout." And Marvin says, if you mention my name to Red Auerbach, he'll send you on the first plane back here. That's how much he hates me," which was probably true because, Auerbach, like a lot of other people, put a lot of faith in Marvin and got burnt. So Marvin's out in California. He's a street bum. He's living on the streets, and his weight goes down to, I think when they measured him at one point, and his weight was 120 something pounds. I mean, it's hard for me I didn't see him, so it's hard for me to picture a guy that's 6'7" and a half weighing 120 something pounds.
This is a guy who, I guess at his peak or when he was playing, in his early days of career, was like at 205, 210?
Yeah, that was his playing weight. Yeah.
It
was sad. I mean, he's broke. He's sneaking onto Walton's property at night, and Walton had like a little cabana out by his pool, and so Marvin there was a refrigerator near the pool. Marvin would have a couple beers, pass out either on a chaise lounge or in the equipment. Walton had like a weight room, so he'd sneak on without anybody knowing. The kids would all be in the house, and Walton's wife would be in the house, and so it was just so one horror show from another. I mean, Marvin ended up, he's just looking for drugs. That's all he was doing. He wasn't eating anything. And at one point, this reporter from the San Diego Union tracks him down and says, "Marvin, I'd like to do a story on it." And Marvin said, "You give me," I forget the figure, "you give me $1,000 and I'll give you a story that'll make you famous. I can tell you about the women in the NBA. I can tell you about homosexuality in the NBA. I can tell you about the craziest stories you're ever going to want to hear. By the time if you write down everything I say, you're gonna have the greatest story you've ever seen." And the guy looks at Marvin, and And again, the guy tracked him down. So Marvin's in the worst part of town, and he just looks a mess. And the guy reaches in to his wallet, pulls out a $10 bill, puts it in Marvin's hand, and just says, "Good luck," and walked away. But all these stories are, he goes. I guess his final chance to make some decent money was when he got signed by Trieste in the Italian league, and he goes over there, and they're paying him big money. I mean, they're paying him, I think it was $40,000 a month, and again, he runs into these drug dealers. They become fast friends, and as usual, Marvin starts missing practices, starts missing games. I mean, the CBA paid peanuts. I mean, he was in this, like I say, he was in the CBA for a couple of years, he made more in 1 month over in Trieste than he'd make in a whole year in the CBA, and it was a great deal. He had no expenses. He had a free car, brand new car, beautiful condo overlooking a magnificent plaza in Trieste, which is a beautiful city. After about a month, the team, he doesn't show for a game, and they let him go. It's just, I believe that was the last time he ever played basketball. But, like I say, after he got out of basketball, I didn't see him that often. He was out in California. Like I say, he spent 2 years and 9 months in a Texas prison. I really didn't see a lot of him. I mean, we talk, but he'd call collect when he needed money or something like that. When he eventually got sober, he was doing a great job. He got sober. He called me up from Providence. He said, "Why don't you come down? I run this program for kids. It's called the Men to Men program, and I want you to see what I'm doing." So I came down there, and it was a great program. He would give these tremendous talks to these kids. I mean, didn't mince words. Language was sort of rough, but the kids got the point. He'd tell a story about, and these were all true stories because I was familiar with a couple of the stories that he told me. But he told a story about how a neighbor had a kid who was shot, and the neighbor asked Marvin if he'd go and visit the kid in the hospital. So Marvin goes to visit the kid, and when he walks in, he wasn't prepared for what he was going to see. The kid, had no brain function. He had a bullet in his brain, and he's talking to a friend of the family, and the friend of the family says, "Yeah, when they found him, he had $500 in his pocket, and we don't know where the money came from." And Marvin knew. He knew it was drug money, and he looks down at the kid, and he sees on the kid's right arm, right down his arm, is the phrase "thug life," and Marvin just and he tells the story to every group that he was talking to. He says, this kid was using drugs. He was in with gangs, and this is what you get: a tattoo that says "thug life," and you die with $500 in your pocket. He said the kid had no brain function, and he wasn't going to regain any brain function. He was dead. for all practical purposes. He just had a heartbeat. And the way Marvin told the story to kids, I mean, he got through these kids. And he did a great job with these kids. I mean, when I was doing the book, I talked to about 6 or 7 of these high school kids that had gone through his program, and they all were doing great. I mean, some of them are still doing great. So Marvin was making a difference, but he was doing so well that the former owner of the St. Louis Spirits, Ozzie Silna, bought him a truck, gave him money to rent an office, hire a secretary, and for a couple of years, Marvin was doing great. I mean, he was having a positive influence on people. I went down there a couple times just to see him, and he'd take me on a ride around town, and people would yell to him, "Hey, Marvin, you're doing a great job. Keep it up, bud." And and he was doing fantastic. And then all of a sudden, Marvin started disappearing, and he fell off the wagon. And the story almost gets, I know it gets monotonous, but to hear, I mean, he just, with drug addicts, I mean, that's how life is. It's one step forward and 3 steps backward. He ended up, cleaning up his act, and calls me up one day and he says, I need a place to stay. And this was 2013, I want to say. So I said to him, well, you can come up and stay here, but, there's going to be some rules, Marvin. I said, no booze, no drugs. You can use I have like a little apartment in my garage. I said, you can use the apartment in the garage. So he comes up and, everything's going great. He's back. He reopened his men-to-men charity. Things couldn't have been better. I hardly ever saw him, but when I did see him, he was great. He was clean. He was sober. He was working with kids. He was going to AA. Matter of fact, he said to me, why don't you come to my AA meeting tomorrow? I'm getting my 3-year chip. So I said, yeah. So I went, and, he was just tremendous. He was doing a great job. And I thought, God, he's finally over this. He's finally conquered this. And again, I mean, everything was, he had been sober for, 3 years plus. Anyhow, he goes down to Providence to see his mother, and he meets up with this young girl. She looks like she's about 20, 21 years old. This is Marvin's version of the story. And and she wants to be a model. So Marvin's girlfriend was a former model. So Marvin says, I'll meet you in this coffee shop tomorrow, and maybe my girlfriend can give you some tips on how to get into the modeling industry. So he does that, and I don't even know anything about it, but he's doing it, and that didn't seem anything wrong with it. But it turns out that the girl is only 17 years old, and she goes to the cops and says Marvin propositioned her. So, and I don't know anything about any of this. I'm I'm sitting at home in Framingham. He's down in Providence, and with his girlfriend. His girlfriend's about 40 years old. I mean, I know her. As things turn out, she goes to this 17-year-old goes to the cops and say this teacher, because he actually met her in he was teaching one of his classes to these young kids, ghetto kids, and he's working his magic with the men-to-men program and doing good work. But he happens to see this 17-year-old girl in the hallway, and he says that's where he first met her. She goes to the cops. The cops ask her if she'll wear a wire and to meet Marvin the next day, which she had planned to do. And so she meets Marvin at this little coffee shop, and of course the cops walk in. I've listened to I actually have the transcripts of the conversations. There's nothing incriminating on the tapes that I've listened to, but the cops arrest him and charge him with solicitation of a minor. He comes back and he's yelling and screaming at me, telling this was a setup. They were out to get me, and I'm not really buying it. I'm not sure. I wasn't there, but I'm not really buying it. I'm like, you must have said something to this 17-year-old for her to go to the cops. And he goes, no, I didn't. And he said, I was just trying to help this girl. So anyhow, he gets a real sharp lawyer. And I'm getting near the end of the story on this, Tim. I don't know. I don't want to bore you to death.
No, I mean, this is tragedy, and it's painful to hear, but it's still very much part of the story, sadly.
So he gets this lawyer. He's telling everybody he was set up, and he's starting to feel sorry for himself. He's in my garage, which is at the end of my house. It's attached to the house, but I can hear him from the other end of the house. He's yelling, screaming, and anybody he's talking to, he's telling them the cops are setting me up, and he's becoming unnerved. So then he starts going out late at night, and I'm suspicious that he might be using. I find I go to take the garbage out one night, and the damn garbage can must have weighed about 60 pounds. I go, what the heck is in here? And I open it up, and it's just filled with beer bottles. And I go in, and I say, Marvin, we had a condition when you moved here: no booze, no beer, no alcohol, no drugs. Oh, I can handle a few beers. I said, no, you can't, Marvin. You're an alcoholic, and you're a drug addict. You can't handle beers. Okay, I'll stop. Well, it's a couple of weeks go by. I come home. I had been out somewhere. I come home. It's late. It's probably 11:30, 12 o'clock. And I go to turn into my driveway, and my headlights hit this car. The car is on my lawn. I mean, it's not even close to the driveway, and it's Marvin's SUV. And so I get out of my car. His music he's blasting the stereo, and he's passed out behind the wheel. It takes me about 15 minutes to wake him up. I thought he was dead, but I'm punching him. I'm shaking him. And finally he wakes up, and I go, Marvin, I said, I don't know what you're on, but this shit's going to stop. I mean, I can't take this anymore. So I say to him, I said, look, you have to check yourself into rehab. If you're not going to go to rehab, then you're going to have to find yourself another place to stay. So he ended up going to rehab. When he gets out of rehab, instead of coming back to my place, he goes down to his mother's place in Providence, which is a major mistake because every drug dealer in Providence knows Marvin, and Marvin knows every drug dealer. So when he calls me up, I can tell he's high. He's slurring his words. It's just it's very hard. It's just very hard to figure out what I can't help him anymore. I mean, he's slurring his words. He's just acting irrational. He might call me at 10 o'clock, talk to me for a half hour, hang up, and then call me back at 11 o'clock and not even remember the conversation. So I say, Marvin, you got to get yourself some help. He goes, no, I'm all right. He says, Mike, he said, next Monday, I have my court date for this solicitation of a minor. You know it's a setup, don't you, Mike? I said, Marvin, if you tell me it's a setup, I believe you. And he says, I need you in my corner. Can you come down Monday? The case is on for 10 o'clock. I said, yeah, I'll be down. Now, almost a year had passed since the time he got arrested for this solicitation charge and his court date. So I come down, go into court, ask the clerk of courts what courtroom is the Marvin Barnes case in. The guy tells me. I go up there. I go to the clerk again, and I said, is this where Marvin Barnes has a hearing? And he looks at his docket, and he goes, well, it was, but his name's crossed off the list. And I go, oh, Jesus. He says he must have called in sick or something. So I get in my car. I'm driving back. I get a call from his ex-wife. He had gotten married to his high school sweetheart years and years ago, and they got divorced. But she still was a good friend of his. So she's calling me. I pick up the phone. Hey, Deb, how you doing? And he goes, she's crying. She's hysterically crying. And she said, they found Marvin in some guy's apartment. He OD'd. He's dead. I go, oh, Jesus. I said, and I always suspected, other guys like Statham and Ernie DiGregorio. We always said, our worst fear was that we're going to find him in some street gutter dead. And this was pretty close to it. I guess the place that he was at was a real dump. But anyhow, I mean, that was it. I mean, 4 months later, the coroner called me, and I'd asked her to call me. I want to know what exactly he died from. And she said he died from acute heroin and cocaine intoxication. And that was it, just a waste of a life. And if you got to know Marvin's personality, you couldn't help but like the guy. I mean, like I say, he caused a lot of people a lot of problems. I mean, teammates, coaches, general managers. But in doing this book, I talked to almost every one of them. And nobody had a bad word to say about Marvin. He was a likable guy. I mean, for all his bravado about being a gangster type, I mean, Marvin didn't even get any fights in basketball. I mean, he wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a guy, he wasn't a guy who got in arguments with referees. Didn't happen. I mean, Marvin was teammates loved him. But nobody could help him. Nobody could help him. I mean, he had to help himself, and that just never happen. I mean, he'd help himself for a couple months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, but sooner or later, that cocaine just overpowered him. I mean, it was sad thing to see.
That's an amazingly personal, story too of yours in his last years. I guess as we sort of round it up here, besides sort of the idea of a wasted life, and clearly it's just tragic, right? But he was certainly known for some very interesting escapades even before sort of the drug use and whatnot. His personality was, certainly something to behold. But I mean, I guess having done all of this, and I think we kind of just scratched the surface in terms of some of his eccentricities, shall we say, and missing airplanes and all that kind of stuff. Some of them quite humorous, actually. How do you frame all of this? Because in some respects, right, as we go back and look at the ABA, for example, I mean, there's nobody who knows or has read about or understands or maybe even lived through the ABA that doesn't have some memory of and or, some maybe even little special kind of fondness for the name Marvin Barnes. What is it, I guess, what is it of this story? I mean, he's still known and remembered, maybe for, some of his exploits, but I mean, besides sort of a wasted talent, I mean, what else, I guess, can we take from all this story? It's tragedy for sure, but there's got to be some glimmers of goodness that lives on from it too, though. No?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I mean, he was beloved by teammates. I mean, Ernie DiGregorio, who was quite a basketball player, he had a unique friendship with Marvin. I mean, they were best friends for years and years and years. And when Marvin died, Ernie was so broke up he couldn't even go to the funeral. He was, he just it was for him. It was a real tragedy because he, like all his friends, but especially Ernie and Kevin Stakem. I mean, they were rooting for Marvin to, so badly to, just make a comeback that would, be lasting. I mean, the guy had a fantastic personality. He was a quote machine. I mean, the story about, I don't want to get on no time machine, where he's taken off for the team's going to Memphis, and then the next morning they're going back to St. Louis, and Marvin looks at the itinerary, and it shows that the plane going back to St. Louis leaves at 12:01 and gets in at 12. And Marvin goes, "How can that be? There's something wrong with the itinerary." Bob Costas says, "No, Marvin, we're going from Eastern to Central time. You gain an hour, so you actually arrive a minute before you take off." And Marvin's like, "I ain't getting on no time machine." And it really, it was really. I mean, the guy he was quick-witted. I mean, Marvin, Marvin as the big gun on that Spirits team, they wanted Marvin to take a leadership role. Marvin's like, some reporter mentions it to him, and Marvin says, "Oh, I'm tired of being known as the franchise. It's eat your vegetables, Marvin. Drink your milk, Marvin. Be on time, Marvin. Do this, Marvin. Do that." I mean, he just was he had a quote for everything. I mean, he was a funny guy, and just like I said, I mean, he had all these teammates that you go through the years, and I know I talked to everybody on the Spirits, and I certainly talked to all the coaches and the GM and the owner, and same with the Celtics. I mean, they all were rooting for him. I mean, you couldn't help but like the guy. And it just was, the demons finally got to him. I mean, he fought and he fought and he fought. Like he says, he was in rehab 22 times, went to rehab 22 times, and 22 times he failed to achieve sobriety. And that's, you know, he had all these people rooting for him, and he just couldn't make it work. Couldn't make it work.
Well, I mean, the ultimate free spirit, and sadly, that spirit, got extinguished probably way too early, like many addicts and wind up, right? And I didn't know much about sort of the personal intersection between you and him, but this book is really something. I mean, it plays on a lot of different levels. I mean, obviously, there's the nostalgia aspect of the ABA, and the prodigious talent that he had for sure, especially in his early part of his career, but also the tragedy and the story that's all too common, right? Regardless if you're a pro basketball player or frankly just an average Joe or a woman in the world, just trying to make ends meet, and drugs doesn't really sort of know any real boundary, nor does it play any favorites, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of sort of tragic storylines to all this. Why don't you tell our audience, let's do some promo here for the book. I know it came out in paperback, so obviously it's been well regarded. I know it's exceedingly well reviewed on places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But why don't you tell our audience about the book, where you can find it, and God forbid we'll actually help you sell a few more books for people to truly understand even more deeply this tragic story that you've remembered so well and written so well.
Well, thank you. It's available on Amazon, at least the paperback. I think the hard copy went through 2 printings, and I believe they're sold out. But the paperback, I know they're in the second printing of the paperback, and they just put up a notice that they're getting another shipment in. I have nothing to do with that, but so I think you could buy it on Amazon. It's called Bad News, and it's not your typical basketball story. It's more a personality story about a basketball player who just fought his demons and finally ended up losing. It's a tough book to read, but it's helped some people. I know that. I've talked to people who had a son, a daughter, a father who had either a drinking problem or a drug problem, and they can relate to how do you reach an addict, and I in doing the book, I talked to a friend of mine who's a DEA agent, and I said, "What can I do to help this guy?" And the DEA agent basically said to me, "You can offer them encouragement, you can offer them advice, but," he said, "don't offer them sympathy and don't offer them money. And you really won't be able to help. You can't help an addict until the addict hits rock bottom." And unfortunately, in Marvin's case, rock bottom turned out to be his overdose, his death. And so many people go through this. I mean, it's an epidemic. I mean, the numbers of people that are dying from drug overdoses, it's just staggering. And I think I think the government and the police are doing, they're making progress, but it's just, now you have all these street drugs, these there's a name for them, but it escapes me at the moment, but you have all these illegal drugs that drug peddlers are buying from China, and kids don't even realize what they're taking, and until it's too late, until the kids die, and it's not just kids. The drug problem is so out of control that You meet adults. I mean, Marvin was 62 when he died. You can be 10 or you can be 60. And you know, the drugs just can take over your life and ruin it. And it's tough. The only thing I can say is that as somebody that's been through it for a while, not me personally, but watching Marvin, it was just torture to go through. It's torture to see somebody you care about basically thrown away chance after chance after chance, opportunity after opportunity. And, you know, he just didn't care. I mean, in the book, I put a line that Marvin became so addicted to cocaine while he was a player, while he was a professional basketball player, that he viewed the sport as just a hobby. I mean, his priority was getting high. I mean, that he didn't care. He lost all his pride. I mean, he didn't care how he performed on the court. He was just there to collect a paycheck. I would never have said that about Marvin after his first 2 years, because he was anybody that was destined to be a Hall of Fame player. It was Marvin, and the drugs took that all away.
All right, not always the most jovial of conversations on this show, but we try to span the range of emotions when it comes to teams and leagues and all the various stories around them. And our thanks to Mike Carey for that very sad tale of frankly, a lost talent, and one, frankly, that could have been greater, could have been brighter, had it not been for the ills of drug addiction. And then some. The book by Mike Carey is called Bad News: The Turbulent Life of Marvin Barnes, Pro Basketball's Original Renegade. It is published by Sports Publishing. It is a very deep, it's an engrossing work, and you will enjoy it. You will learn from it, and you will get a sense, frankly, of some of the craziness of the American Basketball Association, some of the players certainly, and the unique and troubled talent of one Marvin Barnes. We thank Mike for his this great conversation, obviously a personal one near the end of Marvin's life. And, we appreciate him sharing that story with us and with you. And I highly encourage you to read more and learn from the story called Bad News by Mike Carey. Highly recommend it. You can find a convenient link to the book on our website, of course, at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I think it's number 137, holy mackerel, with Mike Carey, and you will find a link to Amazon. And when you do so, you'll be giving us a couple of nickels or dimes of love and keeping the lights on for our little show. By doing so, we appreciate that. And I'm sure Mike will appreciate it as well, of course. And what else? At goodseatsstillavailable.com, you will find a whole host of other things to see and do, including literally all of the other episodes we've done to date. You can download them, embed them on your website, do whatever you want with them. That's legal, of course. What else? You can find all of our social media links, of course, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You find us on Twitter. You can find us there at goodseatsstill. You will find us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable. And yes, you will find a page devoted to us on Facebook as well. You can also send us some email from the site or send it to us directly if you'd like. And that email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Also, while you're on the site, if you want to sign up for our weekly newsletter, you can do that too. Just find the link and you'll get whisked away to a form, and that will hopefully get you signed up for our little weekly blast that tells you a couple of days in advance of what episode is in the chute for this coming week. And one last thing, of course, we want to say our tremendous thanks, as always, to our pal Jerry Payne, the good doctor, down in suburban Atlanta. We appreciate his efforts and that of Podfly Productions, the place to go to get all your podcasting needs in the editing and production worlds figured out they are the best at what they do. I highly encourage them and their services. If you're trying to get into the podcast game, you can find out more about them. There you go. Podfly Productions at podfly.net. Okay, it's been a long day. Let's send you off into the ether, and we look forward to seeing you next week. We appreciate your listening, and thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.